Seeds of a Shadow War. The 1980s opened with the world divided not by geography, but by ideology. The Cold War was at its peak, a global chessboard where every nation was a potential pawn between the United States and the Soviet Union. In Latin America, that tension erupted into revolutions and counter-revolutions, and nowhere was this more visible than in the small Central American country of Nicaragua. For decades, Nicaragua had been ruled by the Somoza family, a US-backed dictatorship known for corruption, brutality, and alignment with American business interests. But in 1979, the tides turned. The Sandinista National Liberation Front, a leftist revolutionary group inspired by Marxist ideals, overthrew the Somoza regime. Their victory sent shockwaves through Washington. To the US, already haunted by the fall of Vietnam and the expansion of Soviet influence, Nicaragua's revolution looked like another domino falling to communism in its own hemisphere. When Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, he brought with him a fierce determination to stop the spread of communism anywhere it appeared. Reagan saw the Sandinistas not as nationalists, but as puppets of Moscow and Havana. He publicly declared that Nicaragua would not become another Cuba and vowed to support the freedom fighters, opposing the Sandinista government. Those fighters were known as the Contras, a coalition of former Somoza soldiers, exiles, and anti-Sandinista rebels, many of them trained and supplied by the CIA. In the early years, covert funding flowed freely. American advisors helped build Contra camps along the Honduran border. U.S. aircraft delivered supplies and weapons. The Reagan administration sold the conflict to the public as a fight for democracy, a noble crusade to stop communism's advance. But behind closed doors, reports began surfacing of Contra units committing atrocities, assassinations, torture, and attacks on civilians. Journalists and human rights observers accused the U.S. of supporting a campaign of terror. By 1982, members of Congress had grown uneasy. The idea that America might be secretly fueling a brutal civil war in violation of international law led to the introduction of a legal restriction known as the Boland Amendment. It prohibited the CIA and Department of Defense from providing direct aid to the Contras. The message from Congress was clear: the United States was to keep its hands off Nicaragua's internal war. But within the White House, that restriction was viewed as an obstacle, not an order. The administration believed it had a moral duty to resist communism, even if it meant defying Congress. Officials within the National Security Council, an advisory body meant to coordinate national security policy, began exploring ways to continue supporting the Contras without technically violating the law. Thus, in the shadows of official policy, a new network began to form. It would be a web of secrecy, deception, and hidden operations spanning continents. The seeds of the Iran-Contra affair were quietly taking root, nurtured by ideology, sustained by secrecy, and justified in the name of freedom. And as the world turned its attention elsewhere, a small group inside Washington was preparing to build one of the most elaborate covert operations in American history, one that would soon spiral far beyond their control. The Boland Ban and the birth of a secret network. When Congress passed the Boland Amendment, it was meant to close the door on U.S. involvement in Nicaragua's war. But inside the Reagan administration, the ban was seen as an affront to presidential authority. The president and his advisors believed that if Congress would not fund what they saw as a moral crusade, then they would find another way. The mission, they thought, was too important to abandon. In the West Wing, a small circle of officials within the National Security Council began to explore how far they could stretch the law without visibly breaking it. Among them was a young Marine lieutenant colonel named Oliver North, ambitious, loyal, and utterly convinced that stopping communism justified any means. His superior, National Security Advisor Robert Bud McFarlane, shared that conviction. So did CIA Director William Casey, a veteran spymaster who saw covert action as the ultimate tool of foreign policy. The Boland Amendment restricted only the CIA and the Defense Department, but it did not explicitly name the National Security Council. This technical gap became their loophole. The NSC, a body originally meant for coordination and advice, was quietly transformed into a covert operations hub, an unaccountable center of power that reported only to the president and a handful of trusted aides. Through private donors, foreign allies, and shadow intermediaries, the NSC began to sustain the Contras in secret. Wealthy American conservatives sympathetic to Reagan's anti-communist stance were approached for private contributions. Countries such as Saudi Arabia and Taiwan were persuaded to make friendly donations to the Contra cause, often under diplomatic pretense. Millions of dollars flowed through unofficial channels, laundered through front organizations, offshore accounts, and humanitarian groups that were anything but. Meanwhile, CIA veterans who had been forced out by the congressional ban found their way back through private contractors. Planes, pilots, and weapons changed hands under the cover of civilian operations. The network operated with layers of plausible deniability. If anyone was caught, there would be no traceable link to the US government, at least on paper. Inside the NSC, Oliver North began keeping meticulous notes and running logistical routes as if he were commanding a private army. He worked out of a small windowless office in the White House basement, a space that would later become infamous as the nerve center of the operation. He liaised with arms dealers, rebel commanders, and intelligence contacts from Central America to the Middle East. To the outside world, the Reagan administration continued to publicly deny any illegal involvement. But in truth, a parallel foreign policy was already taking shape, one hidden behind the official one. It was run not through diplomats or congressional oversight, but through covert operators answering directly to the Oval Office. The system thrived on secrecy and shared belief. Those within it saw themselves not as lawbreakers, but as patriots correcting the mistakes of weak politicians. They believed history would vindicate them. Yet every decision they made, every dollar they moved in the dark, pushed them further down a path where exposure was only a matter of time. What began as a workaround to a congressional restriction was evolving into a full-scale underground government operation, one that would soon cross borders, defy laws, and test the limits of democracy itself. The Iran connection. By the mid-1980s, the shadow network sustaining the Contras was running low on funds. Congress had tightened oversight, international donors were hesitating, and even sympathetic allies feared the growing scrutiny. But the men operating in secret inside the White House were not ready to stop. As they looked for new sources of money, an unexpected opportunity emerged, one that would connect a civil war in Central America to the volatile politics of the Middle East. In 1985, Iran was in the middle of a brutal war with Iraq. The United States had publicly declared Iran an enemy and imposed a strict arms embargo. Yet deep within the American government, a group of policymakers saw a possible opening. Several American citizens had been kidnapped by pro-Iranian militant groups in Lebanon. The Reagan administration was desperate to free them. Some officials began to argue that secretly reaching out to elements inside Iran might help secure the hostages' release, and perhaps open a channel to moderates within the regime. National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane became a leading advocate of this idea. He was joined by CIA Director William Casey, who believed covert diplomacy could serve U.S. interests better than open confrontation. Through a network of middlemen, Israeli intelligence contacts, European brokers, and private arms dealers, secret communications began between Washington and Tehran. Israel, an American ally that already had covert dealings with Iran, acted as the intermediary. The arrangement was simple on paper but dangerous in practice. The United States would supply weapons to Iran through Israel, Iran would pressure its allied groups in Lebanon to release the hostages, and in return, the U.S. might gain strategic leverage in the region. Oliver North quickly saw another layer of possibility. If arms could be sold to Iran secretly, the proceeds could then be diverted to fund the Contras, circumventing Congress once again. What began as a supposed humanitarian negotiation to free captives became a financial lifeline for an illegal war. The first shipments of American-made TOW missiles left Israel for Iran in 1985. The transaction was masked under intelligence exchanges and labeled as an attempt to open channels of moderation. In truth, it violated not only U.S. embargo laws but also the very policy Reagan himself had declared: no arms to terrorists, no deals with hostage-takers. When the hostages were indeed released, the operation appeared to work. Encouraged, officials pushed further. More weapons were sent, more promises were made, and more money flowed back into the secret accounts. But every success was temporary. For each hostage freed, another was taken soon after. What was being presented as a diplomatic triumph was in reality a revolving door of ransom disguised as policy. Meanwhile, Oliver North and his contacts quietly siphoned off the profits. The funds from the arms sales were not returned to the U.S. Treasury, they were redirected into offshore accounts managed by intermediaries. From there, money and supplies were funneled to the Contra forces in Nicaragua. The circle was complete. Illegal arms sales to Iran were now financing an illegal war in Central America, both hidden from Congress and the American public. Inside the White House, the president was told that the operations were modest and aimed at freeing hostages. Reagan, deeply affected by the plight of the captives, approved the shipments. But what he was not told, or chose not to fully know, was that his administration was now running a complex international black market under the guise of patriotism. The Iran Channel had opened doors that could not be easily closed. And within that secrecy, lines between diplomacy, deception, and crime were no longer visible. The machinery of covert policy was in motion, feeding on success, denial, and the belief that the ends justified the means. What no one foresaw was that a single mistake, a crash, a leak, or a misplaced document, could bring it all down. And that moment was already on the horizon. The money laundering web. As the Iran arms channel expanded, the operation's complexity deepened. What began as a series of discrete weapons shipments had evolved into a global financial maze designed to conceal the movement of millions of dollars. Every transfer had to vanish behind layers of false identities, coded transactions, and offshore accounts. The architects of this system understood that money left a trail, and to survive, that trail had to be erased. Oliver North, working from his cramped office in the White House basement, became the central coordinator. He was not alone. He relied on a network of private operatives and former intelligence officers who knew how to move funds without detection. Among them was Richard Secord, a retired Air Force Major General, and Albert Hakim, a wealthy Iranian-American businessman with deep connections in the arms trade. Together, they formed the Enterprise, a clandestine organization that blended government policy with private profit. The Enterprise used front companies registered in Switzerland, Panama, and the Cayman Islands to mask the flow of money. Profits from the sale of U.S. weapons to Iran were deposited into secret accounts, where they were then redirected to supply the Contras with ammunition, uniforms, medical kits, and even aircraft. The movement of funds was disguised as legitimate trade, with paperwork crafted to appear routine. To the banks, it was just another series of corporate transfers. To the world, it was invisible. The money laundering network also drew support from sympathetic foreign governments and wealthy donors. Saudi Arabia quietly contributed tens of millions of dollars to support the Contra cause. Bribes and commissions were buried in arms contracts, while false invoices hid the true nature of the exchanges. The system became self-sustaining, a web of interlinked interests, where covert policy met private greed. Each new transfer carried its own risks. Swiss bankers asked questions, customs officers grew suspicious, and intelligence agencies outside the loop began to notice irregularities. But within Washington, the secrecy was total. Only a handful of people, North, Poindexter, Casey, and their foreign intermediaries, understood how vast the operation had become. Even the State Department and Pentagon were kept in the dark. By 1986, the network had grown so large that it began to slip beyond the control of its creators. Some of the arms dealers involved saw an opportunity for personal gain, overcharging for weapons or diverting cargo to black markets. The line between official policy and criminal enterprise disappeared entirely. Money that was supposed to fund the Contras sometimes vanished before reaching them. Private brokers enriched themselves under the protection of American secrecy. Inside the White House, North maintained detailed records, handwritten notes, coded messages, and daily logs of operations. In them were the instructions, amounts, and dates that connected the entire system. These notes, which he believed secure, would later become the very evidence that proved the affair's existence. The machinery of the operation had become too complex to unwind. With every shipment and every deposit, the risk of exposure grew. Yet those running it convinced themselves they were defending freedom, that secrecy was a necessary burden of patriotism. What they failed to see was that their web of money and deception had become a trap, and every strand they added only drew them closer to the inevitable collapse. In the shadows of legality, the Iran-Contra network was now fully alive, part covert mission, part criminal enterprise, and part ideological crusade. It was a state within a state, operating under the illusion of moral purpose. But as history would soon show, no secret stays buried forever.